Welcome back for part 4 of the C5 Corvette clutch installation. In part 3, we just completed installing the new LS7 flywheel, clutch disc, and pressure plate assembly, so if you missed it, there's a link to it in your upper right hand corner. To kick off part 4, let's address the leak between the main transmission housing and the transmission tail section that most of our 20-year-old C5 Corvettes have, including mine.
Toys for life.
Here's a good look at the entire assembly and how I have it mounted in my custom fixture that simplifies things when performing this repair. As you may recall, I've already drained the fluid from the transmission, but there's still more inside. So let's go ahead and split this transmission now, and I actually did this shortly after removing the transmission from the C5 because it will continue to drip for a day or two, and I want to give it plenty of time to do so because I don't want anything to drip out of the bottom of the transmission when I'm applying the sealant to the case and bolting it back together. Clearly, I need to modify my holding jig to allow for placing a drain pan underneath. It's been a couple of days, so let's spread the case apart far enough so I can get my hands in there with a cloth and solvent to remove all of the old adhesive as well as the transmission fluid residue. I actually shoot a little solvent inside the case near the bottom several times over the course of a day or two to get the remaining transmission fluid out as well. This is super important because if some remaining transmission fluid oozes out when you're trying to apply the RTV, it just won't work. Now I can reinsert the two magnets that sit in the bottom of the transmission that I took out to clean and give the case one final cleaning. Next, I apply a thin layer of Permatex Ultra Gray on one side of the case and then tighten the case back together to spec. I like to use a little bit of blue Loctite on the bolts here as well. If you use the correct amount of RTV, you should end up with just a tiny amount being squeezed out past the edge. Next, let's tackle the reverse lockout solenoid cover as well, which is leaking, and this would be an extremely difficult repair to make with the transmission fully in place, so it just makes sense to do it now. I start by removing the solenoid, followed by the 4 bolts holding the cover on. When I remove bolts that are not torqued to yield, I typically put them in a glass jar of solvent right away, which dissolves the grease and grime so that they can be easily reused. Once the cover is removed, all surfaces are cleaned to remove the old RTV and then cleaned with solvent as well. Then a thin layer of gray RTV is used on one side of the mating surface, and the bolts can be inserted and retorqued to spec. Then the solenoid O-ring is inspected and replaced if necessary. Then a light coat of transmission fluid is wiped on it, and the solenoid is reinstalled. Now I carefully move the torque tube into place and slide it onto the transmission's input shaft. Then once again I use a little blue Loctite on the bolts and tighten them all to spec. Now let's install the remote bleeder, which is essentially just a hose extension for the bleeder valve, moving it to somewhere you can actually get at it. Step 1 is to remove the stock bleeder and toss it. Step 2 is to install the union with the copper washer between it and the slave cylinder to seal it to the slave cylinder. Step 3 is to install the hose, and there is not enough room to tighten it with the slave cylinder bolted to the torque tube, so we'll just have to loosen the slave cylinder a little bit. If the hose has a learned bend in it like ours does, be sure to angle it towards the front driver's side of the car, as that is where it will be fished up through the firewall area and into the engine bay on the driver's side. Now we can tighten the hose fitting and retighten the slave cylinder, again using a little bit of Loctite. Christoph has been kind enough to join me once again for installing the torque tube transmission differential assembly, and I strongly suggest you find a capable assistant like Christoph, as it does usually take a little bit of muscle for this part. Everyone has their own custom method for reinstalling the drivetrain. Mine is to use several jack stands and a floor jack with a modified adapter that actually fits quite securely to the bottom of where the transmission and differential meet. My floor jack has a hole in it where this lifting cup drops into place, so what I've done is to cut a small piece off of an old GM 10-bolt axle shaft. Trust me, it won't break, and I did a little grinding to the end to get it to fit securely into this hole. Then I made a couple of extensions out of pipe that give me different levels of lift so that I can lift the drivetrain up to a certain height, support it on jack stands, swap in a new length of pipe, and then lift the drivetrain to the final height to be able to gently roll everything into place. Now that we have the drivetrain close to being in position, it is time to fish the remote brake bleeder hose up and into the engine bay. Things are tight, so make sure you carefully select the route so that it doesn't get pinched as you raise the assembly further into place, and it allows the remote bleeder to end up in a reachable location in the engine bay. I wish they made this hose a little bit shorter, as it really doesn't need to be this long. Now for the challenging part, getting the drivetrain 100% lined up so the torque tube shaft goes straight in through the clutch disc and into the pilot bearing. Once it is where you think it should be, both you and your assistant need to apply forward muscle to get it into place. It will not go all the way in until it is 100% lined up, and it is a very precise fit. Sometimes you get lucky and you get it just right in a short period of time. On this day, Christoph and I persistently worked at it for quite a while before it finally slipped into place. Now it is time to torque the torque tube to bell housing bolts down to spec, and now that they are cinched down tight, here is that slave cylinder clearance that we measured before. You can see the little gap between the black plastic and where it would bottom out if it was pushed a little bit further back towards the torque tube, and as a final check, this looks great. Time to reconnect the clutch line. I've pulled off this protector that comes with the new slave cylinder. I have wiped down the male connector on the master cylinder. I put the new O-ring on that comes in the kit, and I'll put a dab of brake fluid, never oil, brake fluid around that O-ring, and I'll snap them together. It does take quite a bit of force to get them to slide together, so make sure you're ready for some maximal effort to get them to pop in. And that little collar, as you can see, needs to be out like it is. Now let's bleed the clutch, because if there is a leak, I want to know about it right now. Step 1, suction out all of the old nasty fluid. Step 2, wipe out all of the solid crud at the bottom. Step 3, fill it with fresh brake fluid. Step 4, using an assistant, bleed the system through the new remote bleeder. And finally, check for any signs of leak coming from the slave cylinder or bleeder connections. Now it's time to replace the clutch inspection cover, and this time I'll use all of the bolt holes. All right, all of the inspection cover bolts are torqued down. The torque tube bolts are torqued down. Working our way back. All of the connectors are on. The reverse lockout solenoid, the skip shift solenoid, and I can't remember what that one is. So all the wiring is buttoned up as well. Before we fully bolt the cradle to the chassis, make sure the main harness coming to the rear of the car is not pinched in this area and that it moves freely. It's a tight fit, and if you're not careful, it can get pinched, and that will cause problems down the road. Next, it's time to refill the manual transmission with Dextron 3 ATF, not Dextron 6. Do not use Dextron 6 in the C5's manual transmission. It is not compatible for use in the C5 manual transmission, period. Now, while we still have the drivetrain disconnected, just so we don't finish everything up 100%, I want to test fire it to make sure I don't have any leaks or anything crazy going on. I expect to get some ABS lights and that sort of thing because I haven't got the wheel speed sensors connected. So let's go ahead and just do a test fire. Survey says, I don't see anything leaking, which is always a welcome sign. Next, I'm going to go ahead and clean the surface on the axle shaft, put a little grease on it, and try to drive it home. Sometimes these can take a little bit of effort. Sometimes you have to use a couple spacers to get the shaft perfectly parallel. In this case, I jacked up on the lower A-arm a little bit with my jack, and I tightened up the shock bolts a fair bit. And now we're ready for the final push of the axle into the differential case. It does take a little bit of work, so get those splines lined up perfectly and make sure you've got enough effort here to shove the axle shaft in. Now I've got the bolts started in the A-arm, so we'll get those tightened up, the shocks tightened up, and we'll connect the emergency brake. Now that those are torqued down, we'll do the cradle to chassis bolts and we'll do the differential mount nuts. The emergency brake cable is attached and on, as is the wheel speed sensor cable. And all we have to do is reconnect the brakes. I just cleaned the rotors with solvent in case I touched them. So let's toss these on. The mid-pipe connections are both a bit rusty and scaly, which will affect their ability to seal. So let's hit them with a wire brush and clean them up a little bit. Next, I leave the header bolts a little bit loose to the block so they can flex just a little bit. And then I attach the band clamps and tighten them snugly, connecting the mid-pipe to the headers. And then tighten the header bolts and then back to the band clamps for one final tightening. Now we just need a set of mufflers to quiet things down. Oh my goodness, it's back on the ground. It's been a while. All the wheels are torqued to 100 pound-feet of torque. And it's time for a test drive. That was a big job. Not only did we replace the clutch disc and pressure plate, we also replaced the flywheel and we replaced the rear main engine oil seal while we were in there. We also fixed a leak in the transmission between the main body and the tail housing, as well as a second leak up near the reverse lockout solenoid housing. In addition to that, we also diagnosed a major oil consumption issue and corrected the PCV system hose routing so the car no longer slurps oil like a Wendy's Frosty. The way it was plumbed was with a hose directly from the vacuum port on the intake manifold to the driver's side valve cover, with no provision for a PCV valve or a flow limiting orifice. The valley cover line was running to the catch can, and the other port on the catch can simply had a breather on it, venting it to atmosphere. I redid the system to run a hose from the valley cover to the bottom of the catch can, then another hose from the top of the catch can to the vacuum port on the intake manifold. By trial and error, I installed an orifice tube with a smaller tube inside the hose coming from the valley cover to reduce the volume of air being ingested by the engine at full vacuum under idle. And then for makeup air, there's a connection from the passenger side valve cover to a new penetration made in the air filter assembly. And now I believe his oil burning issues should be drastically reduced. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Using a lift makes this job a lot easier, but if you are young, flexible, motivated, ambitious, and persistent, this job can be done on jack stands. The toughest part of this job I'll tell you in just a second, but first tap that thumbs up below, and since you made it through this series of clutch replacement videos, for the love of Zora Arca Stuntoff, subscribe if you haven't already. The hardest part of the job was getting the torque tube and transmission assembly lined up exactly with the engine, not only front and back, but also side to side, so that you're able to bolt the two components back together. And for that part, you're gonna need some patience, and you absolutely need a little extra muscle in the form of a good assistant. Sometimes you get lucky and it just takes a couple minutes. Sometimes you gotta work at it for quite a while. The most frustrating part of the job was the header wrap and the sharp little stainless steel band clamps that hold the header wrap to the headers. As you may recall, to remove the bell housing inspection cover, I had to unbolt and lower the headers from the vehicle, and anytime you disturb the header wrap, it likes to disintegrate very easily, leaving little shards of fiberglass to get stuck in your fingers, your throat, and if you're not wearing safety glasses, in your eyes. Now guys, that's a wrap, pun intended, on this 4-part series on how to replace a C5 Corvette clutch. If you learned anything, tap the thumbs up, consider subscribing. Most of all, thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next video.